Today at the National Press Club, Danielle Wood, Su-Lin Ong and Cherelle Murphy. Representing the Women in Economics Network, they'll be laying out what they think the priorities are for next week's federal budget. Danielle Wood, Su-Lin Ong and Cherelle Murphy with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra for today's Westpac address. My name is Anna Henderson. I am the Chief Political Correspondent for SBS World News and representing NITV, as well as a board member here at the club. Our guests today are Danielle Wood, the CEO of the Grattan Institute, Su-Lin Ong, Managing Director of RBC Capital Markets, and Cherelle Murphy, EY Oceania Chief Economist, here to make their pre-budget address to the National Press Club of Australia. Danielle Wood will be delivering the main address, and then all three guests will be joining me to take questions from the working press. We're now just days out from the release of the federal budget. If the October budget update from Labor was a temperature check on the economy, this upcoming piece of economic work is the full diagnosis. The election campaign included some very expensive key promises from Labor on the health, education and infrastructure fronts, and of course the continuation of the Stage 3 tax cuts. Now the cost of living environment is intense. Inflation remains high and sticky. The pressure for people to get relief on housing is ramping up. And then there's an unexpected interest rate increase just on the eve of the budget document. At the same time, the government has flagged significant plans to spend on defence and released the Migration Review, confirming a record-breaking influx of people to the country during this cost of living crush. All these topics and more, no doubt, ahead to discuss. You can follow the conversation on Twitter @PressClubAust or #NPC. Please welcome Danielle, Su-Lin and Cherelle.
Thank you very much for that, Anna, and thank you to the National Press Club for hosting us. I would like to start by recognising the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. I recognise the contribution they make to the life of this city and region and pay my respects to their elders past and present, including to those for any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing today. I also want to thank the Women in Economics Network for this event, but more broadly for the work that you do. When the network formed almost 6 years ago, women were almost non-existent in the economic conversation. In 2019, Stream Media Monitoring released analysis showing that of the top 50 economists cited in the Australian media, only 9 were women. And collectively, those 9 had fewer media mentions than just one man, the admittedly prolific Shane Oliver. The Women in Economics Network made one of its objectives to raise the profile of women in economic debates. And as the woman that slipped in at number 50 on that list back in 2019, I can say today that the media landscape looks different. Shane remains prolific, but the range of people that now grace our TVs, our radios, our social media feeds, commenting on everything from interest rate rises to climate policy, is now far more diverse. And I think the economic conversation, and particularly economic policy, is better for that diversity. So thank you to the Women in Economics Network, thank you to the Press Club, and thank you to all of the media outlets that have been part of that shift. Let's turn now to the budget. All budgets, of course, are a product of their time. They respond to the economic and social climate of the day. They reflect the priorities of the governments delivering them, but also the political reality those governments face. For this budget, there are 3 major backdrops that will shape its formation and how we measure its success. First is the macroeconomic reality. Australia came out of the COVID recession in far better shape than any of us, I think, would have expected in those anxiety-inducing early days of the pandemic. Growth came back with a vengeance in 2022, and with it, a beautiful set of labour market numbers. Unemployment with a 3 in front, underemployment down to 6%, participation at record highs. But the less desirable side dish of this strong economy, sourced with a series of supply shocks, has been much higher than comfortable inflation. Real household incomes went backwards in the past year as households have felt that cost of living squeeze. More recent normalisation of supply chains, as well as the Reserve Bank's stiff medicine, 11 cash rate rises and counting as of yesterday, is starting to bring inflation down, but it remains well above target at 7%. And it is not forecast to get back to the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% comfort zone until mid-2025. Households feeling the squeeze will invariably look to government for support. The wish list facing this government in its budget preparation is long. Yet a ramp up in government spending would risk keeping inflation higher for longer and making the RBA's job harder. The overall goal must be to take money out of rather than put more money into the economy. The second defining backdrop for this budget is the coalescence of demands for more support for the most vulnerable. Advice published in the past few weeks from the government's Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee and the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, the latter of which I'm a member, made powerful cases for higher spending on those facing severe hardship. After 20 years of slipping further behind community living standards, Australia's unemployment benefits are now among the lowest in the OECD. The Economic Inclusion Committee found that the current level of the job seeker payment and other payments such as youth allowance are seriously inadequate. The maximum rate of job seeker, just $347 a week for a single person, or $430 a week with full rent assistance and supplements, does not allow people to meet their minimum basic needs. People on these payments are forced to choose between paying their electricity bill, getting the medicine they need, or skipping their next meal. They struggle to find affordable rental properties. The rationale for maintaining payments at a low level is to provide an incentive to find work. And at just 43% of full-time minimum wage, the incentive is undeniable. But the payment is so low that it actually acts as a barrier to work. It is hard to be job ready when you cannot afford transport to get to the job interview, or you're preoccupied with how you're going to feed your kids that night. Given this, the Economic Inclusion Committee recommended a sizable increase to job seeker and related payments. The Women's Economic Equality Task Force called for the single parenting payment to be extended to parents with children above the age of 8. Currently, many single mothers are pushed onto the lower job seeker payment when their youngest child reaches that age. Both committees recommended an increase to rent assistance, given the distance the $79 a week payment has slipped behind private market rents. Addressing this list could put a serious dent in poverty in Australia. It would make Australia a better and fairer nation. But after so long in the too hard basket, doing it all at once would come with a sizable price tag. This pushes up against the third defining challenge of this budget, the size of the structural budget problem. The medium-term fiscal outlook is far from healthy. Spending on the NDIS, defence, hospitals, aged care are all expected to grow strongly over the next decade. Government spending is projected to average more than 27% of GDP over this period, compared to less than 25% in the 3 decades before COVID. Revenues have not kept up. Future structural budget deficits are projected to be about 2% of GDP, or about 50 billion in today's dollars. Grattan Institute estimates that the true figure is closer to 70 billion. Debt as a share of the economy is expected to continue to climb, even as the economy stabilises. This fiscal challenge may be hard to fathom when we look at the short-term, much happier budget numbers. Revenue windfalls are back with a vengeance. A stronger than expected labour market and high commodity prices, especially relative to Treasury's comically conservative assumptions, are expected to see revenue write-ups of more than 200 billion since the pre-election fiscal outlook. The government's monthly financial statements show the budget was in surplus in March 2023, and the year-to-date deficit was much more modest than expected, 11 billion. But if there is any fiscal lesson this country should understand, it is the danger of locking in long-term spending against short-term gains. The Treasurer's commitment to bank most of the revenue upgrade is welcome. I will be watching with interest to see how far the definition of most might be stretched come budget night. A fork in the road. So how does the government square the circle on these 3 big themes? The needs of the most vulnerable suggest spending more. but the macroeconomic and fiscal circumstances dictate restraint. Assuming the government acts in a broadly economically responsible way, there are two paths forward. The first path, and the one I expect the government will take, is a cautious one. They will likely adopt some of the lower cost proposals that would help ease the squeeze on the most vulnerable. Judging from what we've seen in the public domain, that is likely to include expanding the single parenting payment to parents with children aged 12 to 14. And while the price tag doing this runs to the hundreds of millions over the next few years, hardly small change, the government is steering clear of the most expensive and far-reaching proposal. The $132 a week increase to JobSeeker, recommended by the Economic Inclusion Committee, would cost the budget almost $6 billion a year and help 920,000 Australians on JobSeeker and related payments. The government has ruled out an increase of that magnitude. We will have to wait till next Tuesday night to know for sure whether any increase is on the cards. An increase for recipients over 55 is now looking like the most likely option. But wherever it lands, the fiscal reality is pushing the government to go smaller and narrower than many, including its own backbench, would like. Consistent with this cautious approach, the government will also take some tentative steps on budget repair, largely by pursuing modest measures that don't offend many people. On spending, that means cracking down on rorts and waste. It means cost of living measures that don't hit the bottom line, such as the very sensible changes to the pharmacy dispensing rules. On tax, it means increases that only hit a small group of individuals and businesses that are unlikely to generate much political sympathy. Already announced is the higher tax on superannuation earnings for the 0.5% of Australians with balances higher than $3 million in retirement. Also on the cards are tweaks to the petroleum resource rent tax to make sure gas producers currently enjoying windfall profits make a better contribution for the Australian resources they are using. Most other increases in taxes have been ruled out. Overall, the picture is of incremental change. It will make some things better and not too much worse. But ultimately, it will only play footsies with the big social and economic challenges. Which brings me to the second, bolder path. This approach would be politically harder, but it would enable the government to go further on meeting some of Australia's most pressing economic and social challenges. On the economic challenge, restoring productivity growth and growing the pie is critical for our long-run living standards. To give it its due, the government is making headway on a number of fronts, including improving and streamlining migration, reforming general practice, and pushing changes to improve education standards. Executed well, these have the potential to boost the growth outlook. But some other pressing changes require government investment. The government has recognised the critical role that women play in the economy. Australia will not meet its potential until we better use the capabilities of our highly talented women. As Women's Economic Equality Task Force Chair Sam Mostyn noted at this very lectern 2 months ago, the full utilisation of one of the most educated, energetic and capable cohorts, women, has never been more important. We know that women want that opportunity. The government's commitment to more affordable and accessible early learning and care, and increasing parental leave and making it more gender equal, are important steps on this journey. The Women's Equality Task Force points to further priorities for improvement. One is better pay for workers in the care sector. While pay rises for aged care workers are on their way, childcare educators earn little over minimum wage. The fact that trained workers doing this critical and emotionally challenging work earn little more than those flipping burgers at McDonald's or manning the counters at Bunnings should shock us. And the market reality is now biting. Poor pay and conditions are impacting on the capacity of the care sector to attract and retain workers. Jobs and Skills Australia estimate that Australia needs an extra 22,000 early childhood workers in the 5 years to 2026. Worker shortages risk compromising the workforce participation benefits that should be unlocked from more affordable childcare on the 1st of July. Finding a path towards higher pay for these educators should be a priority. The second is the childcare activity test. The activity test significantly restricts access to subsidised childcare for families where one parent works less than 16 hours a fortnight. And while it was conceived as an incentive to encourage mums to work, it has achieved the opposite. Many parents are caught in a chicken and egg conundrum. They cannot find a job because they haven't got suitable care, but they can't get subsidised care because they don't have a job. Women in Economics Chair, Dr. Angela Jackson, in the audience today, has estimated that the removal of the activity test would result in 40,000 more women with children under 5 participating in the workforce and an increase of $4.5 billion to the economy. Over time, measures that give women an opportunity to participate in the paid workforce and children the chance to get high quality early learning and care pay dividends many times over. Another area where there is scope to be bold is housing. Last year's National Housing Accord set a target for 1 million new homes over 5 years. Something a cynic would perhaps note is pretty much in line with the number of new homes built over the previous 5. But what the Accord did get right was the centrality of housing supply in improving housing affordability. As well as creating more dwellings, boosting supply in the areas people want to live, generally in suburbs within a reasonable distance to major urban centres, would supercharge growth in economic activity. The biggest barrier is overzealous planning restrictions that impede medium density development in our inner and middle ring suburbs. State governments have the capacity to change this, but the NIMBY backlash weakens resolve. The federal government should offer incentive payments to state governments to add to new housing supply. This would be an investment in better economic and social outcomes. Finally, in this bolder world, the government could also support an increase in job seeker and related payments that would reduce poverty and support work readiness for the close to 1 million Australians living on them. Of course, all that daring has a price, and the government would need to neutralise the inflationary and fiscal impacts of these proposals by making hard decisions on increasing taxes and reducing spending elsewhere. While there are no easy options, there are options that make sense, especially in a fiscally constrained world. So let me embrace boldness and make some suggestions. Grattan Institute's pre-budget report, Back in Black, proposed a menu of options for tax increases and spending reductions that could make a meaningful dent in the budget deficit. Redesigning the Stage 3 tax cuts by retaining the 37-cent tax bracket would still give a tax cut, but it would reduce the size of the tax cut for high-income earners and save about $8 billion a year. That alone would offset the fiscal and inflationary impact of a job seeker rise. Reducing tax breaks and minimisation opportunities by winding back super tax concessions, reducing the capital gains tax discount, limiting negative gearing, and setting a minimum tax on trust distributions could collectively raise $20 billion a year. Reducing fuel tax credits to better reflect the environmental damage caused by heavy vehicles would add another $4 billion. Grattan's report also canvasses changes to the super preservation age, freezing the superannuation guarantee, and higher or broader GST as possible options. On spending, the best discipline would be to adopt better processes for infrastructure and defence procurement. Making better decisions up front, based on economic and strategic rather than political considerations, would have saved tens of billions of dollars over the past decade. And while we can't get that money back, we can do better in future. Our report puts out another $15 billion of savings measures, including undoing the WA GST deal, counting more of the family home in the age pension asset test, and improving hospital efficiency and purchasing in health. Over time, changes will also be needed to sustain the fast-growing NDIS. I understand these are not easy conversations. One commentator on the weekend labelled them courageous in the Sir Humphrey sense, and I'm going to come back to the degree of political difficulty in a moment. But a budget that brought in some combination of these measures would be a bold play for a richer, fairer and more financially sustainable Australia. And I think that is worth going into bat for. Let's talk briefly about the price of boldness now. This budget marks almost a year in office for the Albanese government. This would normally be the budget where the government makes the hard decisions, in the hope they are long forgotten by the next election. So if steady as she goes is the theme for this budget, it will almost certainly be the overarching theme for the government's first term. One common refrain from those hoping for bigger reforms from government is to sheet home all the blame to politicians. The current mob lacks vision or courage or leadership. And while I'm sure there's some blame to go round, I think the reasons governments over the past 2 decades have struggled to do hard things are more complex. Given I am at the Press Club, the home of Australia's media, let me suggest one important contributor: the media as an amplifier of conflict in so-called national conversations. This is nowhere more obvious than tax policy. Tax needs to be on the agenda for governments. Tax reform can contribute to higher growth. We also need to collect more revenue as a share of the economy, as the structural deficit is too large to be realistically closed by spending reductions alone. And although some in the media love talking about the political difficulty of tax increases, it is media outlets that give a disproportionate share of time to tax changes compared to other decisions made by governments. Indeed, too often the rhetoric is dialed up to 100 and front pages are littered with anyone that stands to lose $1. Let's take this budget's super tax changes as an example. The modest change to wind back tax breaks for 80,000 of the most well-off was labelled a class war, a death tax by stealth, and a supersized broken promise. It received front-page coverage from the major tabloids, wall-to-wall coverage in our 2 national papers, and generated more than 1,200 online media mentions in the month after it was introduced. In contrast, the government's policy to expand government-paid parental leave to 26 weeks and encourage more dads to take leave, announced just 6 months earlier and benefiting 180,000 families a year, received less than a quarter of the coverage in the 4 weeks after it was announced. Similarly, in the 2019 election, Labor's $1.6 billion a year policy to wind back negative gearing, at that point a 5-year-old policy for the party, received more coverage in the election campaign than the combined coverage of its 2 new major spending commitments: $800 million for free dental cover for seniors and $600 million to tackle out-of-pocket costs and waiting lists for cancer patients. Does this just reflect public sentiment? Well, interestingly, no. When the public were polled about the super tax changes in the week of their official announcement, 64% supported the policy, including 70% of voters under the age of 50. Not bad for a policy claimed to be an attack on Middle Australia. The media may have been surprised at the public's views, but I wasn't. We have seen exactly the same disconnect between the volume and tone of coverage and resilient public popularity for other tax changes when they are on the agenda, including winding back negative gearing. None of this is to say that tax changes, or indeed spending reductions, are easy. But we should not confuse media excitement with an inability to bring the public along. My reading is that when our political leaders do the work, tilling the ground, explaining the changes and why they are needed, hearts and minds can shift. That is why I will continue to advocate for bold policy. Bold is what we need to meet our current economic and social challenges. And it is the benchmark by which I will judge the government's budget on Tuesday night. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Well, something for us to think about in the media at the end there. I guess what I would say is that, you know, there was a promise taken to an election. There was clear wording from politicians around what Labor took to the public, and then there was a policy that came from that, which was different. So at what point, when we're looking at politicians and what they take to the public to go into a ballot box and make that decision, at what point should we stop really robustly holding governments to account on that?
Yeah, look, I'm certainly not suggesting that you should stop governments, holding governments to account, nor that tax changes shouldn't generate media conversation. My point is merely, you know, what seems to be the disparity in the amount of coverage. Equivalently sized spending proposals just simply do not get the same front page coverage, the same amount of mentions as tax changes. I think that comes down to the fact that it is kind of easy to play up the conflict in tax changes, and that's, you know, pretty irresistible to the media business model. So absolutely tax changes deserve scrutiny, but it's interesting to me, and I think it does contribute to the position we're in, which is, you know, frankly, we haven't had major tax changes in 20 years in this country, because that just makes it that much harder to get something done.
Yeah. A question to all three of you then. In terms of the budget, and it's sort of bearing down on us like a freight train, what is the reality here? There's some senior economists now saying this could be the recession ahead that we did not need to have. So what does the government need to do in that budget document to avoid that outcome as much as they can in the kind of broader economic context?
I think the budget will be very closely looked at next week in terms of the fiscal restraint and, to Danny's point, really how much of the revenue that this government banks, because right now, as the economy slows and as we wait for the interest rate hikes of the last 12 months to continue to bear down and slow demand, the last thing we need is additional stimulus into the economy. So this combination of monetary and fiscal policy moving in the same direction is really important for economic outcomes, including determining how much of a slowdown we have and whether we possibly tip into recession. So from a markets perspective in particular, very focused on the restraint that will be delivered, that's being promised next week, not putting any additional demand into the economy, any additional pressure on the Reserve Bank to take rates higher, which will be what will drive a much more significant slowdown in the economy.
So Cherelle, building on that then, does that then mean that it's completely understandable that the government would not go ahead with a stimulus like wide-ranging increase to job seeker?
It certainly needs to put it in the context of what other changes are in there. So if you wanted to help out those on lower incomes and those who need support, there's not too many people that would argue against that, but you've got to offset it elsewhere. And you might even have to more than offset it in this current context. So we've had a very stark reminder from the Reserve Bank yesterday that inflation is still way too high. I think fiscal policy could be doing a little bit to help out the Reserve Bank here by going even tighter. So not only not spending the revenue gains, but actually tightening up a bit. But how the government does that within its own suite of policies is clearly really important to how the distributional impact looks. And I think there is very much a case for helping out on the low income side. And there's also plenty of areas where potentially you could pull back on the higher income earners.
And so, Danielle, when it comes to that question and the widely reported suggestion that perhaps a job seeker increase could target people over the age of 55. In this economic climate, is that, in your view, and with all the work that you've now been involved in, a fair enough position for the government to take?
Look, I understand why they are concerned with a big and broad increase in job seeker, especially if you tie your hands on doing some of the things that could offset it, like stage 3 tax cuts. It then makes it harder to do those shifts. So the decision to focus on the over 55s, that is a group that absolutely needs more support. We know that a lot of them have been on the payment for an extended period of time. We know they face particular challenges in getting back into the jobs market. It can be very hard as an older job seeker. That said, I do think it is a bit of a slippery slope, this division of people on those payments. Equally, people under 55 are really struggling to get by. And the sense that we're sort of creating these two classes of welfare recipients, one more worthy of an increase than others, I think is a dangerous precedent. So even though I understand the desire to keep the increase modest, I'm not really a fan of the proposal of dividing it up in that way. But I would never begrudge anyone over 55 an increase if that was all that was on the table.
Because you said there you understand why broad-ranging increase to job seeker is politically difficult. Not to put words in your mouth, but raising that question, for people who might not understand beyond the sheer cost why there is an issue with raising job seeker, what's the policy reason why an increase to job seeker could have a suppressant effect?
So the concern about a big increase would be the inflationary impact, that you're putting more money into the economy, that money gets spent and therefore it adds to demand. My counter argument was really that you can do other things to help offset that. Given that is such an important policy priority, we can make that happen, but we have to be willing to do the other things to offset any stimulatory impact that policy would have.
Can I just add to that? I think at this particular point in time, with inflation moving ahead so quickly, the cost of living rising, in other words, real wages not keeping up with the cost of living, it does kind of bring an urgency to this, which hasn't been there before. So we've been sort of talking about increasing the job seeker for some time, but I think this particular year, it does look more urgent than it has in the past.
Thank you. Our first question is from David Crowe.
Thanks, Anna. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. Thanks for your time. I wanted to pick up on something that Danielle said about stage 3 tax cuts and maybe just bring in the other members of the panel on that issue because, as you've mentioned, inflation's high. With inflation, bracket creep is a bigger factor now. I'm interested in your views on how high inflation and bracket creep may change the debate around stage 3. I know we've had discussion about stage 3 tax cuts for many years now, but I'm interested in all of your views on whether high inflation changes that calculation because bracket creep is real for a lot of workers.
I'll go first. You're right, David, of course, the bracket creep is becoming more of an issue. In fact, when you look at the share of taxes compared to household disposable income, towards the end of last year, they were racing ahead, which is essentially people moving into higher tax brackets. There's a little bit of COVID kind of tax payback coming back into the mix there too, but there is, certainly households are paying more out of their income into tax, and that's not ideal from a number of perspectives in the sense that at the margin it will discourage workforce participation, you know, that sort of the marginal day or the extra day that the second income earner in particular is thinking about working. These are not desirable from a broad economic point of view. As I guess, Danielle's been at pains to point out, it is a balance, it is a balance. We've got to kind of give a bit here, take a bit there. So I think there is definitely a case for, potentially not changing so much on helping out workers from a bracket creep point of view. But again, it's got to be put in the context of what does the overall fiscal picture look like.
I'd probably add to that, I mean, that really is key. But, when we think about the challenges to revenue longer term as well, I mean, that's really where the debate is, I think. We know that expenditure will continue to rise. What we need is a structural uplift in revenue. That's really what the debate is about. And so, when we look at Australia and we look at the amount of revenue that is raised from the income base, Australia does stand out from an OECD perspective as being overly dependent. And so that's part of, I think, the discussion behind the stage 3 income tax cuts, the inflation and possibly elevated inflation for a longer period of time. I think that adds to that discussion as well. But it really is also about looking at our revenue base. How much of it do we want to be reliant? Australia is about 40-odd%. The OECD average is about 25%. It's a material difference. And that's where, as Danielle says, we need to look at broader measures of revenue beyond just the income tax cuts. So I think the stage 3 tax cuts are very much in that framework of inflation, the revenue base and the reliance.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll just add a couple more comments. I mean, those tax cuts were calibrated in a totally different fiscal environment. So remember, these were brought in 2019 before COVID happened, in the world where we all had our back in the black coffee mugs and we thought we were going to be seeing surpluses as far as the eye can see. Yes, in a world with higher nominal wage growth, you get more bracket creep. Worth noting, we haven't really had spectacular nominal wage growth yet. So the bracket creep problem, in fact, we've undershot a lot of the earlier estimates, so the bracket problem isn't as acute as some people talk about it as yet. But it is real, and that's why we have advocated for a scaling back rather than a total elimination of those tax cuts. When they were designed, they undercompensated for the impact of bracket creep in the middle of the income distribution. They overcompensated at the top of the income distribution. So the proposal that I've put, which is basically retaining that 37-cent tax bracket, that would mean for people earning over $120,000, they would still get a tax cut, just not as large. I think better strikes the balance between some compensation for bracket creep, recognising that is real, while also recognising we do have a revenue challenge. And, you know, in the current structural budget position, I think the government would be right to say, look, times have changed. It looks really different to when we first looked at those, and so we're making the decision to wind back.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah Eisen.
Sarah Eisen from The Australian. If I could just ask you, Danielle, on your point regarding payments to states to incentivise them for housing supply, can I ask you to expand a little bit on that? Would the scope of that be something that would be billions or even tens of billions of dollars necessary to get over, you know, NIMBY, as you said? Well, what would that look like? And more broadly, in the upcoming budget, are there areas where all of you or one of you thinks there could be more done to increase female participation or inequalities beyond the activity test, looking at that, which Danielle did point out?
Yes, so let me start with the payments to the states. What we have in mind is something that sort of looks like the national competition policy payments that were done in the 1990s, which was the federal government going to the states and saying, okay, there's a whole lot of really important reforms that we know are politically hard, you know, getting rid of the potato marketing board and opening hours, trading for firms. Also, there was all sorts of state-based reforms, and they said, you know, if you do these things, we will give you money. And part of that is, you know, decreasing the degree of political difficulty. Part of it is recognition that if the states actually do things that grow the economy, the Commonwealth gets a dividend from that. This seems to me to be ripe to happen in housing. So at the moment, we have not kept up over time in terms of housing supply. To the extent we are adding new supply, we're adding it on the fringes of cities. And so we're creating a world where people, particularly if they want to work in the kind of high productivity jobs in the city centres, have hugely long commutes, which we know is damaging for you know, physical health, mental health, and overall economic activity. So incentivising states to be able to add more capacity in the inner and middle ring suburbs, where often you do get that strong political backlash, it allows them to say, well, look, if we don't do this, we don't get that $1 billion from the Commonwealth Government. So it takes away some of the political heat, and hopefully it allows us to start to make progress where we need to.
I'd probably add to that from a macro perspective that there is a real urgency to increasing supply. You know, we've known for some time, particularly as the borders have opened up, the return of the net migration, be it initially temporary and then permanent, and we've lifted those caps. We've known that the demand would be picking up. So I'd argue there is, you know, a fair degree of urgency. The challenge is significant because when we look at all the housing metrics in terms of lending for housing finance, lending for construction, that's all been declining quite substantially, as you would expect in a rising interest rate environment. So there's multiple challenges here, but I would argue that, you know, we've known about this for a while. There should be more urgency around this issue, and it is much more around increasing that supply than incentives on the other side, really. You know, I'd say that's quite key.
And just on opportunities to support women's participation and so on in the budget, do you see any opportunities besides maybe the activity test where you think there could be some room to move here?
I think evening up the provisions on parental leave, that's one of the more obvious ones in the sense of giving, you know, exactly the same benefits to men and women, so that you're kind of equalising the benefits to both, which not only has the sort of benefit of financial sort of money in the pocket for women, but can also create cultural change, which actually has very long-standing implications and can potentially sort of last generations rather than just be a kind of a one-off thing. Ironically, housing policy and many other policies will feed into this as well, because it's enabling women to work, say, close to their workplace. That can be very important to get participation, because if it's an hour commute, you know, to your workplace, that makes the decision whether or not to work or not, or to work 4 days as opposed to 2. These can be quite important. So I think we've got to kind of approach this quite comprehensively.
Can I just expand on the parental leave point? Because I think that is a really important policy lever in terms of government sending a signal that, you know, dads can take that time in the early years when their child is young. We know from the overseas experience that when they do that, they tend to stay more involved when the child is 2 and 4 and 6, and that does provide, better balancing of care within the family unit and more scope for women to participate in the paid workforce. At the moment, it's great that this government has made the announcement to expand the allocation to 26 weeks from 20. That is a big move, but it is challenging within that 26-week envelope to get that kind of signal, because we don't want to be taking leave away from mothers. We know that support is really critical in that early year. Mothers will want to take that time, they want to breastfeed and have that time. So within 26 weeks, it's kind of hard to send a signal. I think you can send a modest one. The average OECD nation now has 1 year paid parental leave. That gives you much more scope to support mums, but also then put aside leave for dads and partners. That is not going to happen in this budget. The government has just announced the increase to 26 weeks. That is important, but over time it would be great to see them go further.
Thank you.
Paul Cupp.
Thanks very much, everyone. You've all spoken about the need for restraint given the inflationary environment, but some of the measures that we're talking about are not particularly expensive, like abolishing the activity test costs an estimated $1.3 billion a year. Not chump change, but we're hardly going to be here in a month saying that was the cause of a 12th rate rise. So I just wanted to ask, are you worried that there's a risk that the government is chasing a paper surplus and that they are neutralising the inflationary impact as an excuse to pursue the talisman of a budget surplus as a sign that they're responsible?
I don't think they're trying to chase a surplus at all. I think they'd be delighted to get one. But I think, the reality is that even if we saw an improvement in this financial year's number, which means it's kind of close to balance, which even that I think could be a push. The structural budget position maintains a deep deficit, and really the structural improvement this year is just because we've had high commodity prices and a strong labour market, both of which we know won't last. So I think the government would be delighted to have that problem, to be honest. I don't think we're close to it, and I think really the important point is that they don't make fiscal policy any more expansionary.
I think that's very much the challenge for the Treasurer here and the government, that they know there are measures that they need to put in place to support disadvantaged, to support low income, yet it's this balancing trick, I think, about not adding to demand. So I think some of those smaller measures that you talk about have merit, particularly if they lift participation further down the track and they're not that costly. It's about, I think, picking the measures that have best bang for their buck in an environment where you are very constrained and where you really don't want to be adding to demand in the near term. Medium term, the challenges are absolutely, as Cherelle says, far more significant if you have a lot of that expenditure baked in, whether it's from NDIS, defence, green transition. They're the choices that we make. That's what we need to fund, and that's where we come back to the need to look at revenue and more significant revenue measures over the longer term.
Danielle, do you think a surplus in even if it is a one-off that's blown away in the later years is possible for this budget?
Look, I think it would be possible, and we know that when governments are minded to hit that number, they can move things around to get there. When I look at where the budget is over the course of this year, as I said, year to date it's only 11 billion in deficit, so you could potentially get there with the will. I don't think the government actually is chasing that. I think it would be counterproductive for it to post a surplus, and that is because of what we're talking about today. That is a short-term revenue windfall. Jim Chalmers is very busy, rightly in my mind, going out and explaining the kind of medium-term challenges that the budget faces. In a way, posting a surplus makes it harder for him to do the hard things that he's going to need to do in the medium term. So I do not expect to be busting out my back in the black mug, which I do own. On your broader point, though, I mean, you are right that we should be thinking about magnitude when we're worried about stimulus, and you can do smaller things without being too worried, particularly if you are willing to offset them. Something I liked that the government has done this week was to start thinking about that infrastructure pipeline, what projects might be paused, what projects actually maybe don't make sense. That has been a big contributor to price rises in the broader economy. Important to remember that a lot of the COVID stimulus in infrastructure is hitting the economy now. We should learn the lesson for the next recession and the way we do stimulus. Infrastructure certainly should not be the only tool that we use, because you can end up in a circumstance where it doesn't hit when you need it, and then it's creating inflationary pressure when you really don't want it to.
And in fact, if I can just add to that, you can actually see when you look at the national fiscal numbers, when you add up the states and territories and Commonwealth spend on net capital investment, that it is projected to actually increase for the next 2 years, which is exactly what we don't need. So I agree, I really welcome that sort of re-looking at some of these projects to make sure that they are absolutely in the national interest, because certainly from a macroeconomic management point of view, they don't make sense.
And increasingly what we've seen with those projects is they are delayed and they run over time, and so their impact hits harder further down the track at exactly when it's not very helpful for the economic cycle, and we've seen that on a number of occasions as well.
And just not value for money either. They're expensive.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Poppy Johnson.
Thanks, everyone. So, Danielle, redesigning the petroleum resource rent tax was one of the items on your menu of measures for budget repair. What do you see as the most likely step from the government on this front? I know they're looking at an inquiry from Treasury at the moment. So what do you think is the most likely step forward, and perhaps the preferred step forward?
Yes. Look, I don't have any inside insights. But there are a number of factors in the design of that tax that you could tweak to raise more revenue. So there is, sorry to get technical, but this is a technical area of tax. You can look at the uplift factor, which is the extent to which people can uplift their capital contributions for writing off against tax. There is the price of gas, which is used within the tax calculation, which tends to be on the low side, so you can play around with the sort of the transfer price. Those, I think, either of those would be ways in which the government could collect more money, and they would be doing that on the basis that the way that tax is designed at the moment just doesn't work particularly well for gas projects. It was designed for different types of resources. It's not. People are kind of looking at the massive profits being made and seeing that the collections are still very, very modest, only a couple of $1 billion a year. That is Australian resources. And so I think the government would be justified in collecting more revenue from that, and those are both options. The other option is just a simple royalty. And because it's offshore gas, they're not paying state royalties. It's not as economically pure as the current design, but it would be a way in which we would be able to very clearly see that those producers are making a contribution to government budgets for their use of those resources.
Peter Martin.
Peter Martin from The Conversation. It's a trade-off, as you've said, Danielle. On one hand, you want to fight inflation. On the other, you want to support the economy. I think what we can agree we don't want is recession, right? So the question is what you actually do. And last night, the Governor of the Reserve Bank was specific. He said he would like measures that brought inflation down to 3% quickly, and to do that, unemployment would have to increase from 3.5 to 4.5%. That's an increase of another 100,000 people out of work. Now, is that, each of you, is that, given that it's one thing to talk about trade-offs, it's another to say where they should fall, does that seem about right to throw another 100,000 people out of work, increase the unemployment rate to what is still a historically low 4.5% instead of 3.5%? Is the Governor right? Is that about what we should be looking at? And each of you?
I can go first on that. I think what the Governor is trying to say is that the economy does need to moderate substantially to get inflation back towards target within a reasonable time frame, and that's the suggestion now, a reasonable time frame. We can't have it up at 6-7% because high and entrenched inflation is very damaging both economically and socially, right across the board, and disproportionately to the more disadvantaged. So we do need that slowdown.
Do we need another 100,000 people out of work?
But as part of that slowdown, inevitably you will see some consequences for the labour market. Less hiring, some shedding of labour, and that loosening up in the labour market is part of the story of economic moderation as well. I think we have to be hopeful in the sense that the starting point for the labour market is so strong. An unemployment rate of 3.5%, 50-year low, still low levels of underemployment, generally ongoing demand. It tells you that the starting point is good, and as activity moderates and demand eases, and there is less demand for labour, that rise in the unemployment rate from a historic perspective should be fairly modest. And if we don't see that, the risk is inflation runs too hot, there is more rate hikes further down the track, and there is a greater impact on the economy and higher levels of unemployment if we don't get inflation down sooner. So it is a price that has to be paid, I think, but we do take some comfort in the fact that the labour market comes from a strong starting point.
Cherelle, that's a pretty bitter political pill to swallow, and for a lot of people out there thinking about their jobs, they would find that really hard to cop. Is there nothing else that could be done to pull the levers that doesn't involve more people out of work?
It's one of the unfortunate parts of monetary policy. It is kind of brutally unfair, and it does create some hardship for some people. And anyone losing their job, is pretty bitter. It has a real human impact. And I'm sure that if the governor could maintain full employment, he would, quite genuinely. I think in these circumstances, it highlights how important it is that fiscal and monetary policy work together, in the sense that, effectively, you're right. The Reserve Bank is trying to manufacture a slowdown, which means unemployment. And whatever that number is, it's even one person out of work is unfortunate. And therefore, it goes back and reinforces the point about why job seeker at these low levels is so crucial. We have to be able to sort of bear the bumps in the economy with people maintaining, the ability to live decently. And so I think the combination of decent social policy from fiscal policy combined with monetary policy, which is kind of trying to level out the cycle a little bit, is really crucial. And one of the things that I think is great about the Reserve Bank's recent review is they recognised that. They said that we have to sort of pull together fiscal and monetary policy and think about it more holistically. And I think that's been really missing from our economy for some time. I would actually go a step further and say, actually, what we need is the states, the state governments, Commonwealth Government, and the Reserve Bank to work together. Because a dollar spent by a state government is just as inflationary as a dollar spent by the Commonwealth. So kind of pulling all those together and thinking about this economy as one is really how we should go about that.
Thank you. Julie Hare.
Thank you. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. I'll just make the point that women as a group tend to do things right. They do better at school than men. They go to university at higher rates than men. They're more likely to get a profession than men. But the Parliamentary Budget Office has pointed out that over the last 20 years, the proportion of women on JobSeeker has risen from 2.2% to 16% in just 20 years. So it seems that for women, having children, not staying married and not getting into the property market are very, very bad things in terms of their long-term financial outcomes, other than an increase in the job seeker payment for the over 55s, which seems to be on the cards at the moment. Have you got any other policy ideas around how women's life course can be improved from the current statistics?
Oh, such a great question, Julie. And it is really notable when you look at that gap, as you say, between educational attainment. Australia leads the world in terms of women's educational attainment, and then the broader economic outcomes that we see. We know there is a gender pay gap. A lot of that is about the segmentation of the workforce and the sectors where women tend to cluster, particularly care sectors, are very low paid. So certainly any proposals that help boost pay to fair levels in those sectors helps. We know that a big divergence in earnings opens up after children are born. So our numbers suggest that if we took an average 25-year-old man and woman today and we project forward based on current labour market patterns, if they go on to have kids, that woman would earn $2 million less over her lifetime. That's because she will be the one that takes the parental leave. She will be the one that goes back to work part-time, probably in a job with a lower wage trajectory. If that relationship breaks up, she will be the one that is more economically vulnerable, and that is a lot of those older women you now see on the job seeker payment. So things that help balance the way we share care, I think, are just so critical. That is why I mentioned paid parental leave before. It is an important thing that governments can do, but businesses have a role to play as well. Not laughing at men when they want to take parental leave, actually supporting them in exactly the same way you would support women. I'm always surprised that people say, oh, well, when men say, oh, I'd love to take leave, but I just can't in my job. So, well, if you're a woman, what would you do? Oh, guess what? They would find a way to make it happen. And then all of us within our relationships trying to push for that better balance, because it matters. It matters for your long-term economic outcomes. So I think it's partly a job for policymakers. They set the tone, they can shape the culture. Some of the settings, like support payments, matter, but it's really a job for us as a nation if we want better outcomes for women.
Yeah, I think we should all say to our blokes, it's your turn to do the dishes tonight. I'm reading the Financial Review. That's mine.
No, I mean, I'd say it is very much lead by example too. So, in financial markets and investment banking, it's probably even more rare for the males to take paternity leave. But when they do in our organisations, we hold it up and we highlight it and we applaud it and we make sure it's well known. We try and fill those positions with internal people, and that promotes opportunities for others as well. But we have to shout out a little bit louder on that.
And a shout out to all the people on parental leave watching at home right now. I hope your children are napping. Nick Stewart.
Following on from the last two questions, with a lot of very engaging coaching from my wife, I've suddenly realised that older, not very old, but slightly older women are such a dynamic, vigorous, offer so much to the economy. So when I hear from the government leaks that we've heard that women over 55 or over 50 are going to be getting job seeker, I think, wow, that's good. But on the other hand, I then think about young women who are maybe single mothers and maybe doing it really tough. And I think, oh, that's terrible. What do dull journalists like myself actually, how should we engage with the budget when we know we're going to be told, oh, these people are winners, isn't that great? Look at the big warm heart that this government has. And we see these other groups that won't be represented in the budget lockup who are missing out. How do we extrapolate from that? What do we take out of the budget bottom line and the way it works? How do we say whether it's good or bad?
Well, big question. So look, I think you're right. So you've got to look at what's not there and who's not getting support, and who do we give voice to? Which goes back to my previous point around tax. I think when we make changes that impact those that are well organised and vocal and well connected, there is a lot of coverage and understanding of how that impacts. A lot of the changes that affect those that are most vulnerable, including the fact that we've had the job seeker payment stay at such incredibly low levels for a long time, reflects the fact that we just don't hear those stories. So you get a lot of reflexive reaction, which is why don't they find a job? It's not until you actually hear the stories of people on those payments. They've often got disability that restricts their capacity to find work. They might be in a region where jobs are not plentiful, and you hear the way they're living, that you fully comprehend, I think, just how brutal that payment is. So I think it's giving voice to those that otherwise don't get a platform.
I was just going to say that aside from those very important issues on the, the sort of, we always have the winners and the losers list from budgets. I think really we're all winning if the government puts in place policies which genuinely enhance the productivity of the economy, which is about growing the economic pie, which means potentially you can have, and as long as it's done in a way that increases the supply capacity of the economy. Because if you can do that, you actually can hold on to more jobs. You can, and ultimately getting a job is much better than being on job seeker anyway, we all know that. So if you can, and this is a really hard one, there's so many different possibilities of doing this and none of them are easy, but if we can genuinely increase the productivity of the economy, grow the size of the economy in a sustainable and inclusive way, then that's when we all win, and that's a good budget.
And I'd pick up on that point. If you listened to the Governor last night, he has refocused on the importance of productivity, particularly in his fight in inflation, and that will be critical in terms of where the path of interest rates ends up. And so I think the measures in the budget that are more targeted at lifting productivity over the longer run is not only good for the broader economy, but it has implications for monetary policy. It can help temper the path over the medium term, and that would be, a good thing all round.
Morris Riley.
Thanks, Anna. We've had some very big announcements in defence, but we're not seeing anything in the forward estimates. How could that be so? And when we do get to the question of raising taxes, what do you think your top three orders where those taxes will, who's going to pay, basically?
The reason we don't see much in the forward estimates is because nothing really happens until the 2030s. These things are very long timelines, and so I would say look at the medium-term numbers if you want to see what's happening, and defence spending is growing rapidly. In terms of taxes that we might need to pay for it, I've sort of set out a list of things today. When we talk about stage 3 tax cuts, they would just be a sort of a down payment. Eventually, you do have to adjust for bracket creep. I would prioritise, I think, trying to minimise leakages to the income tax base. I think we've just got a whole lot of tax concessions, tax minimisation opportunities that are just not well targeted to a policy purpose. Super tax concessions are still incredibly generous compared to any benchmark you might use. So I think there is scope to better target tax concessions. I would like to see the GST on the table for debate. Su-Lin made the point that when we look at those international comparisons, we are underweight in terms of what we collect from consumption taxes. We can do that in a way that is fair. If we pair it with income tax cuts and increases in welfare payments, you can come up with a package that's not regressive and would provide a more stable tax base for the government going forward.
I think, we'd be very supportive of that broader discussion on the GST and broadening the revenue base in Australia against the over-reliance on income tax. But to do the offsets, you need to have a stronger fiscal position. You need to be able to compensate, and that does mean some bigger dollars. And that's why I think greater fiscal consolidation must be necessary for a number of reasons, to think about doing better, more holistic tax policy further down the track, and also to provide buffers for external shocks. So, that kind of stronger medium-term fiscal position, I think, is really quite important. The issue, I think, with the defence spending, and it doesn't show up in the forwards because it's only about 10 bill in the forwards, but it really jumps up beyond that, is that it's just one of a number of big structural expenditure, it will be there, and we'll see that structural deficit deteriorate beyond the forward estimates. And that, I think, is the much bigger issue. So, you know, for us in markets, the near-term picture is good. Markets will probably welcome that next week, but it's that longer-term picture. And is there a possibility that ratings agencies start to talk a bit more about the bigger structural expenditure further down the track, and that rising debt to GDP? And that's probably something we should think about as well.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add much more beyond I agree, the GST, I think the superannuation tax concessions and then the leakages out of the system as they currently stand are the most obvious. But we've kind of known this for a very long time. It clearly, you know, it's going to take a brave government, and as Danielle has been pushing for some bold moves here, because we just have to change this. We have to improve the structural position of the budget, because if we don't, you know, we've got intergenerational equity, we have no buffer to protect us from what could be additional crises like we've seen recently with COVID and with the GFC. We will struggle to pay for the things that we need to do to get to net zero by 2050. You know, it's really important, and we've got a long list of possibilities. Ken Henry's come up with some great ideas. Danielle's always got great ideas on this. We just have to do it, and we collectively have to let the government do it too.
All right, well, we'll wait until the budget drops on Tuesday afternoon into all of our laps so we can see what it's about. I think we need to really thank three senior economic brains who just happen to be women, and now they can have membership of the club as well. So we really appreciate your time.